Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it.
The mysterious neighbor.
When we first arrived in the city, everything felt like a dream. The bustling streets, the vibrant energy, the promise of new beginnings. It was exactly what we had hoped for. After weeks of searching, we finally found a charming old apartment building nestled in a quieter neighborhood, far enough from the chaos, but still close to the heart of the city. It was perfect. The building had this timeless charm, with its ivy-covered walls, large bay windows, and a view of the park that we couldn't resist. It felt like a place where we could really start our lives together. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and settling in. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, at least the few we met in passing. The building had an air of history about it, with creaky wooden floors that groaned under our footsteps and a warm, musty smell that spoke of years gone by. The hallways were dimly lit, with old-fashioned sconces casting long shadows on the walls, giving the place a cozy, if slightly eerie, atmosphere. But it was the nights that felt different. During the day, the apartment was filled with light and the sounds of the city outside. But as the sun set, a heavy silence seemed to descend upon the building. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed every sound, leaving only the occasional creak or distant murmur to break the stillness. I found it unsettling, though I didn't want to admit it at first. After all, it was an old building. Creaks and groans were to be expected. There was one thing, though, that I couldn't shake: the presence of the neighbor upstairs. We hadn't officially met him, but I had caught glimpses of him through the crack of his door. An elderly man, frail and bent, with deep-set eyes that seemed to follow you even when he wasn't looking directly at you. He never spoke, never acknowledged us, just stood there, watching from the shadows of his apartment. There was something about him that made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off as just nerves from the move. As we settled in, I began to notice the noises. At first, it was just the floorboards creaking, the kind of sounds you'd expect from an old building. But soon, they became more distinct, more unsettling. Late at night, when the city had quieted down and we were lying in bed, I could hear them, soft, indistinct whispers coming from above, like someone muttering under their breath. Sometimes there was a faint sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, slow and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the old man moving around, or perhaps even my imagination running wild. But every night, the noises would return, growing more pronounced, more impossible to ignore. There was a strange rhythm to them, almost like a ritual, and with each passing night, the sense of unease grew. It felt as if the very air in the apartment had thickened, heavy with something unseen but deeply unsettling. I didn't mention it to my partner at first, not wanting to seem paranoid. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the sounds consumed my thoughts, creeping into my dreams and turning them into restless, disturbing fragments of sleep. Something wasn't right in that building, and deep down, I knew it had something to do with the neighbor upstairs. But we had just moved in, and I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. After all, we had found the perfect place, hadn't we? Still, the thought lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind as the strange noises continued to echo through the night. As the days turned into weeks, the strange noises from the apartment above became a constant presence in our lives. What started as a mild curiosity slowly grew into an all-consuming obsession, particularly for my partner. We had been living in the building for nearly a month, and yet we had never seen the old man leave his apartment. Not once. It was as if he was tethered to that small, dark space, hidden away from the world. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe he was just a reclusive person, someone who preferred the solitude of his home. But my partner wasn't so easily convinced. They began to question everything. Why did we never see him in the hallways? How did he get his groceries? Why did the strange noises only happen at night? The questions multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last. I could see the effect it was having on them. My partner would spend hours sitting by the window, staring at the apartment above, waiting for any sign of movement. They'd lie awake at night, listening intently to the sounds that now seemed to come from all directions. Soft shuffles, indistinct whispers, and sometimes something that sounded like scratching. It was driving us both to the edge, and I knew something had to give. One evening, my partner decided they had had enough. "We need to know what's going on up there," they said, a mix of fear and determination in their eyes. I wasn't sure what they hoped to find, but their resolve was unshakable. Before I could protest, they were already heading out the door, up the creaky stairs to the old man's apartment. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway felt colder, darker, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. My partner knocked on the door, 3 firm taps that echoed down the empty corridor. For a long moment, there was only silence. I was about to suggest we leave when we heard it, the soft shuffle of footsteps from within, approaching the door. It creaked open just a crack, and there he was, the old man, barely visible in the dim light of his apartment. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by shadows, with eyes that seemed to sink deep into his skull. He stared at us, unblinking, his lips moving as if he was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage. My partner tried to introduce themselves, but the old man cut them off with a low, incomprehensible murmur, something between a whisper and a groan. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. Then, without warning, he slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the hallway. We stood there, stunned, our minds racing with the brief but unsettling encounter. I could tell my partner was more determined than ever to figure out what was going on, but all I felt was a growing sense of dread. That night, the noises returned, louder and more insistent than before. I was jolted awake by what sounded like crying, a soft, mournful wail that seemed to seep through the walls. My partner was already awake, eyes wide with fear. We both lay there, paralyzed, listening as the crying turned to something else, something darker. It was almost like chanting, a rhythmic murmur that set my nerves on edge. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or perhaps the old man talking in his sleep, but deep down I knew better. There was something in those sounds, something that didn't belong. I could feel it in my bones, a cold, creeping terror that made it impossible to close my eyes. We didn't speak that night. There was nothing to say. We both knew that whatever was happening in that apartment above us, it was far from normal. And the worst part was, I had the sinking feeling that we were only just beginning to uncover the true horror that lay within those walls. The encounter with the old man left a lingering unease that we couldn't shake. My partner became increasingly obsessed with understanding what was going on in the apartment above us. The strange noises, the old man's unsettling behavior, it all pointed to something far more sinister than we initially imagined. I tried to convince them to let it go, to just focus on settling into our new life, but their curiosity had turned into something darker, something that resembled fear. One day, after a particularly restless night, my partner decided to dig into the history of the building and the mysterious neighbor upstairs. They spent hours at the local library, poring over old records and newspaper clippings, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to have no clear solution. When they returned, they looked shaken. "I found something," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "The last tenants who lived in our apartment, they moved out suddenly without any explanation. No forwarding address, no notice. They just vanished." My stomach dropped. "Maybe they just found a better place?" I offered weakly, but I knew that wasn't the case. The building was old, but it was charming, a place you'd want to stay in, not flee from. "It's not just that," my partner continued, their eyes wide with unease. "I couldn't find much on the old man upstairs. There are barely any records on him, just a name and an outdated lease agreement from decades ago. But I did find something else, rumors, whispers from past tenants. They say he's been here longer than anyone can remember. Longer than anyone should be alive." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to tell my partner to stop, to leave the past buried, but I could see the determination in their eyes. They weren't going to let this go. A few days later, something strange happened. As I was leaving the apartment to run an errand, I noticed something lying in the hallway outside our door. It was an old, weathered book, its cover cracked and faded, with strange symbols etched into the leather. I hesitated, a chill running down my spine, but something compelled me to pick it up. When I brought it inside, my partner's eyes lit up with a mix of fear and excitement. "Where did you find this?" they asked, barely able to contain themselves. "It was just outside," I replied, placing the book on the table. "I don't know what it is, but it feels wrong." My partner didn't hesitate. They opened the book, flipping through pages filled with symbols and diagrams that neither of us could understand. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as they studied it, their brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't just any book," they said after a long pause. "It's connected to the old man, to the noises. I'm sure of it. These symbols, they're the same as the ones we've been hearing about in the whispers." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew they were right. The book, the noises, the old man. It was all connected, part of something much larger and more terrifying than we had imagined. That night, the tension between us reached a breaking point. My partner had become convinced that the only way to put an end to the madness was to confront the old man directly. I begged them not to go, to leave it alone, but they were resolute. "I need answers," they said, their voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't keep living like this, not knowing." I watched helplessly as they grabbed the book and headed upstairs, towards the old man's apartment. I wanted to follow, to stop them, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by a terror I couldn't shake. When my partner reached the old man's door, they found it slightly ajar. They paused for a moment, then pushed it open. The door creaked on its hinges, revealing the apartment within. I followed, unable to stay behind any longer. The sight that greeted us was worse than anything I could have imagined. The apartment was a complete mess, as if no one had lived there for years. The walls were covered in strange symbols, the same ones from the book, drawn in what looked like dried blood. Candles of varying sizes littered the floor, their wax hardened into grotesque shapes. Mirrors hung on every wall, reflecting distorted images of the room back at us. But the old man was nowhere to be found. My partner stepped further into the room, their breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I could see the fear in their eyes, but also a twisted sense of victory. They had found what they were looking for, even if it was far more horrifying than they had anticipated. As we stood there, taking in the scene, a sense of dread washed over me. The old man was gone, but the room felt alive with his presence, as if we had just walked into the heart of something ancient and malevolent. I knew then that we had crossed a line, that whatever was happening in this building was far beyond our understanding, and that we were no longer just witnesses to it, we were now a part of it. The days following our discovery in the old man's apartment were shrouded in an unsettling quiet. The once familiar sounds, the creaks, the whispers, the scratching, had vanished, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to seep into every corner of our apartment. At first, I thought it was a sign that whatever nightmare we had stumbled upon was finally over. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was thick, suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. That night, the nightmares began. They were vivid, unlike any dream I had ever experienced. I found myself wandering through endless hallways that twisted and turned in impossible directions. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols from the book, pulsing with a sickly, greenish light. And always, just out of sight, I could feel eyes watching me, tracking my every move. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, only to find my partner staring blankly at the ceiling, their eyes wide with terror. The book had become a constant presence in our lives. It seemed to have a life of its own, often found open to pages we hadn't touched, with its ancient, weathered pages turning on their own. The images within were grotesque. Twisted faces, contorted bodies, and dark, swirling symbols that made my skin crawl. My partner became obsessed, spending hours hunched over it, desperately trying to decipher its meaning. As they delved deeper into the book, the revelations began to unfold. The old man, it seemed, had been involved in something far darker than we could have imagined. The rituals depicted in the book were ancient, twisted practices designed to prolong life or summon things that should never be brought into our world. My partner found notes scribbled in the margins, written in a shaky hand that could only belong to the old man. They spoke of sacrifices, of bargains struck in the dead of night, and of a price that had to be paid, one that could never truly be satisfied. It became horrifyingly clear that the old man was no longer entirely human. Whatever he had summoned, whatever dark power he had invoked, had changed him, twisted him into something else, something that defied all understanding. The more we uncovered, the more the building seemed to turn against us. We tried to leave, to escape the nightmare that had consumed our lives, but it was as if the building itself had trapped us. The layout, once familiar, began to shift and change. Hallways that should have led to the exit now twisted back on themselves, leading us in circles. Doors that once opened to the outside were now sealed shut, and windows revealed only darkness, no matter the time of day. It wasn't just the building that turned against us. We began to hear the old man's voice, soft, insidious whispers that crept into our minds when we were most vulnerable. He spoke of our fears, our doubts, peeling back the layers of our sanity until there was nothing left but raw, unfiltered terror. The voice was everywhere, echoing in our heads, filling every quiet moment with a low, persistent hum that never ceased. My partner, once so determined, was now a shell of their former self. The book had consumed them, its dark knowledge warping their mind. They mumbled incoherently, their eyes glazed over as they traced the symbols on the walls with trembling fingers. I could see the madness taking hold, the darkness seeping into their very soul, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it claimed them completely. The apartment above, where we had once heard nothing but eerie silence, now emitted a low, continuous hum. It was a sound that burrowed into your skull, relentless and maddening. I found myself unable to think, to focus, as the hum grew louder and more insistent, driving me to the brink of madness. We were trapped, caught in a web of our own making, and the more we struggled, the tighter it became. The building, the book, the old man, they were all connected, pieces of a puzzle that we could never hope to solve. And as the days turned into nights and the nights into a blur of nightmares and terror, I began to wonder if we had ever truly been alive at all, or if we had simply walked into a trap set by something far older and more malevolent than we could ever comprehend. There was no escape, not anymore. The darkness had claimed us, and all we could do was wait for it to consume us completely. We had reached our breaking point. The book, the nightmares, the old man's whispers. It was all too much. We knew we had to end it, to destroy the source of our torment before it consumed us entirely. My partner, now a shadow of their former self, was the one who suggested it. "The book," they said, their voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "We have to destroy the book." There was no other option. We gathered what little courage we had left and set about our grim task. The apartment felt alive around us, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. As we prepared to burn the book, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of our perception, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. We took the book to the small fireplace in our living room, the one we had never used. My hands shook as I doused the ancient pages with lighter fluid, the acrid smell filling the room. My partner struck the match, their eyes locked on the book, as if daring it to fight back. And then, as the flames licked the edges of the pages, the door to our apartment creaked open. He was there, the old man, or at least what was left of him. He stood in the doorway, his body twisted and unnatural, a grotesque parody of the human form. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken deep into his skull, glowing with a malevolent light. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth that seemed too large for his mouth. The air around him crackled with dark energy, warping the space around him. For a moment, we were frozen in terror, unable to comprehend the horror standing before us. But then, as if sensing our intent, the old man lunged forward, moving with a speed that defied his frail appearance. The apartment around us began to twist and warp, the walls bending and buckling as if the very fabric of reality was coming undone. We fought for our lives. The old man, or whatever he had become, was relentless, his movements unnatural and jerky, as if he was being puppeteered by some unseen force. He struck with inhuman strength, sending us crashing into the walls, the floor, the furniture. But we fought back, driven by sheer desperation. The apartment seemed to pulse with energy, the walls closing in around us, the floor shifting beneath our feet. It was as if the building itself was trying to trap us, to keep us from escaping. In the chaos, I could see the flames beginning to consume the book, the pages curling and blackening. The old man let out a sound, a guttural, inhuman wail that shook the very foundations of the building. His body convulsed, the twisted form writhing in agony as the book burned. The walls around us began to crack and splinter, chunks of plaster falling from the ceiling as the apartment started to collapse. "We have to go," I screamed, grabbing my partner's hand. The old man was still thrashing, his body contorting in impossible ways, his screams echoing in our ears. The building groaned, the floor buckling beneath our feet, as we stumbled towards the door. The apartment was coming down around us, the walls collapsing inward as the dark energy that had held it together began to unravel. We barely made it out in time. As we burst through the front door, the building behind us collapsed in on itself, the sound of splintering wood and crumbling brick deafening. We ran, not stopping until we were far enough away to watch the entire structure implode, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and debris in its wake. For a moment, there was only silence. The oppressive energy that had plagued us was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. We stood there, gasping for breath, covered in dust and debris, too stunned to speak. But the relief was short-lived. As we drove away from the city, the weight of what we had experienced began to settle in. We had escaped, but the scars of that night were etched deep into our souls. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards in our new home, every unexplained noise sent a jolt of fear through us. We had left the building behind, but the darkness had followed us, a constant reminder of the nightmare we had survived. Even now, I can still hear the old man's voice in the back of my mind, a low whisper that never truly fades. The nightmares continue, the images from the book burned into my memory. I know that what we did that night was necessary, but I can't shake the feeling that we didn't fully vanquish the evil we encountered. It's out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it does, I fear that we won't be able to escape it a second time.
The step on the stairs.
I remember the first time I heard the steps. It was just after midnight on a quiet Tuesday when I was jolted awake by the sound of someone walking up the stairs. My apartment was eerily silent except for the rhythmic thud of footsteps that seemed to echo from the stairwell. First, I brushed it off. It was an old building, creaky and prone to settling noises. Maybe a neighbor was coming home late, or perhaps someone had just moved in. I listened as the steps grew closer, each footfall deliberate and measured. They seemed to start from the ground floor and ascend with a slow, deliberate pace. When the footsteps reached my door, they stopped. The pause was so exact, so deliberate, that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I waited in the darkness, my heart racing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the old pipes or someone carrying a heavy load. But curiosity and fear got the better of me. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole, but there was only darkness on the other side. I hesitated, then opened the door, but the hallway was empty. There was no sign of anyone, only the dim light flickering from the ceiling. I closed the door and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was nothing more than an old building playing tricks on me. But as the nights went by, the pattern grew too regular to ignore. Every night, at exactly the same time, the footsteps would start from the ground floor, make their way up the stairs, and stop right outside my door. The steady, unnerving tread became a nightly ritual, and each time I opened the door, the silence greeted me like an unwelcome guest. The nightly visits continued, and with each passing day, the sound of footsteps grew more unsettling. It wasn't just the stairs anymore. Sometimes, the footsteps seemed to echo from the hallway outside my apartment. The once familiar creaks of the building now felt like a sinister symphony, amplifying my growing unease. I started to question my own sanity. Was it just my imagination running wild? The rhythmic pattern of the steps and their consistent pause at my door were too precise to be merely coincidental. I began to feel like a puppet being manipulated by some unseen force. One evening, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, I decided to investigate. I told myself that maybe a neighbor had a habit of pacing at night or that there was some maintenance issue I wasn't aware of. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I began to keep a notebook, meticulously noting the exact times and details of each occurrence. I recorded the footstep start and end times, the exact number of steps, and any peculiarities I observed. The more I wrote, the more I noticed a disturbing pattern. The footsteps always began at exactly the same time, 12:15 a.m., and they always stopped right in front of my door. I'd hear the rhythmic tread as it ascended the stairs, pause briefly outside my door, and then the sound would just stop. I even tried to stay awake and catch whoever it was in the act, but every time I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The consistent pattern and my growing obsession with the sounds were starting to take a toll. My nights were filled with anxiety, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to grow darker. Despite my efforts to rationalize it, every creak and groan of the building now felt like a deliberate part of a larger, more sinister game. One particularly restless night, the sound came again, louder, more insistent. It was 12:15 a.m. exactly, and the footsteps were more pronounced than ever. I could hear them growing closer, echoing up the stairs and stopping just outside my door. My anxiety was through the roof, a knot of fear tightening in my chest. I hesitated, torn between the desire to remain hidden and the overpowering need to confront whatever was causing this torment. My heart raced as I approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. With a trembling hand, I peered through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. There, on the other side of the door, was a shadowy figure standing perfectly still. It was indistinct and shrouded in darkness, but it was unmistakably there. The sight sent a chill down my spine, and I could barely hold myself together. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I slowly opened the door. The hinges groaned softly, and I half expected to confront someone. But when the door was fully open, I was met with an empty hallway. The lights flickered above, casting eerie shadows that seemed to mock my fears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the darkness. My eyes strained to make out any detail, but the hallway was deserted. The figure I had seen through the peephole was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. The emptiness of the hallway seemed to absorb the light, making the silence even more suffocating than before. I closed the door slowly, my mind reeling from the encounter. The once familiar surroundings now felt alien, as if I had just stepped into a different, more sinister reality. The figure had vanished, but the sense of dread lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. As the days turned into weeks, the nightly visits became more horrifying. The footsteps evolved from a simple pause at my door to a relentless pacing, as if someone was waiting for me to do something. My apartment felt like a cage, and no matter where I went or what I did, the sense of being watched never left me. One particularly harrowing night, after a set of footsteps that felt more threatening than usual, I decided I couldn't take it any longer. My resolve hardened as I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, trying to muster up every bit of courage I had left. The apartment was eerily quiet, but the oppressive feeling that something was lurking just out of sight made my heart race. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges loud in the stillness of the hallway. The dim beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing an endless corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. Every shadow and corner appeared menacing, like they were hiding something sinister. I moved cautiously, checking every corner and crevice for any signs of intruders. My footsteps echoed softly as I walked, but the silence of the building felt more oppressive than reassuring. The flashlight beam danced over the walls, revealing nothing but peeling paint and neglected maintenance. Just as I was about to turn back, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was then that I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, that seemed to come from behind me. The sound was so faint I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, flashlight sweeping through the dark. Again, there was nothing but the empty hallway stretching before me. The whisper had vanished as quickly as it came, leaving me alone with the growing dread that something was very wrong. I tried to steady my nerves, but the sense of being followed, of something lurking just beyond the reach of my light, was almost unbearable. As I made my way back to my apartment, every creak and groan of the old building seemed amplified, adding to my mounting terror. I closed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The hallway was silent once more, but the fear clung to me, a relentless shadow. The whispering had left an unsettling mark, and the night seemed darker, more oppressive than ever before. On a particularly cold and dreary night, the footsteps became an unrelenting pounding that seemed to sync with the rhythm of my own frantic heartbeat. The relentless noise grew louder, more deliberate, each step resonating with an almost mocking cadence. The fear I felt was palpable, and the building's oppressive silence was broken only by that rhythmic, taunting beat. Driven by a need for answers, I dove into the building's history, hoping to find some rational explanation for the terror that had taken over my life. The investigation led me to unsettling revelations. The apartment had a dark past. The previous tenant had disappeared without a trace years ago, and the case was never resolved. The apartment had remained vacant for a long time, a grim reminder of its sinister reputation. When I returned home that night, the familiar pounding awaited me, more intense than ever. It felt as though the building itself was resonating with my fear. Each thud seemed to echo my own escalating panic, growing more frenzied as if the entity was aware of my discovery and was feeding off my terror. Desperate and terrified, I decided to confront whatever was causing this horror. I stood in the middle of my living room, trembling but resolute, and shouted into the darkened silence, demanding answers. The apartment seemed to close in around me, the walls shaking as if responding to my challenge. The temperature dropped, and an overwhelming presence filled the room, something ancient and malevolent that seemed to thrive on my fear. The darkness enveloped me, and I felt a chill that penetrated to my very core. The pounding grew more chaotic, as if the entity was trying to break through the fabric of reality itself. My heart raced as I faced the entity, a looming presence that defied comprehension. I realized in that harrowing moment that this was not something I could defeat or escape. The terror was a part of the building, a malevolent force that existed beyond the grasp of human understanding. As I confronted the darkness, a chilling truth emerged. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. The terror that had haunted me was not just a ghost or a curse. It was a fundamental part of the building, a living nightmare that thrived on fear. The realization left me with a profound sense of despair. I knew that no matter what I did, the darkness would remain, an eternal and unsolvable mystery that had claimed my sanity and safety. The night ended in a profound silence, but the oppressive weight of the entity remained. I understood that I had faced something beyond the reach of human comprehension, and that some questions were better left unanswered. The building, with its dark secrets, would continue to stand as a monument to the terror that had consumed me.
The Unknown Order.
I wasn't expecting anything that morning. I had just settled into my usual routine, enjoying the quiet solitude of my small suburban home. It was the kind of neighborhood where the most exciting event was the occasional garage sale or a new family moving in down the street. The peace was something I'd come to cherish since moving here. No surprises, no disruptions. So when I opened my front door to find a package sitting on the porch, my first reaction was confusion. The box was small, unremarkable, but something about it made my skin prickle. It had no return address, no markings at all, really. Just my name, handwritten in a scrawl that I didn't recognize. I racked my brain, trying to remember if I'd ordered something online, but nothing came to mind. I hadn't been shopping recently, and I wasn't expecting any gifts. I brought the box inside, a growing unease gnawing at the back of my mind. As I set the package on the kitchen table, I hesitated. Everything about it felt wrong, but curiosity got the better of me. I fetched a knife from the drawer and carefully sliced through the tape, my heart pounding a little harder than it should have. The cardboard flaps popped open with a faint creak, and inside, nestled in a bed of old, yellowed newspaper, was an object that seemed to belong to another time. It was an antique doll, at least I think it was supposed to be a doll. It was small, maybe no bigger than my hand, but the details were disturbingly lifelike. Its porcelain face was cracked, with one glass eye slightly askew, giving it a permanent look of something between sorrow and malice. The clothes it wore were tattered, the fabric stained and frayed, as if it had been forgotten for decades. As I reached out to touch it, a shiver ran down my spine. The porcelain was cold, unnaturally so, and as my fingers brushed against it, I could have sworn the air around me grew colder too. I pulled my hand back, staring at the doll, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled in my chest. This wasn't just an old toy. It felt like something more, something sinister. The longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I became. Why would someone send me this? And more importantly, who? My unease turned to outright fear as I noticed something on the doll's chest. A small, faded locket, tarnished and barely hanging on by a delicate chain. I gingerly opened it, revealing a tiny, faded photograph inside. It was too worn to make out any details, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. I placed the doll back in the box and closed it, hoping that shutting it away would also close off the anxiety clawing at my insides. But that night, the house felt different. The warmth that usually enveloped me had been replaced by a cold, oppressive atmosphere. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks after the unsettling discovery. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The lights flickered once, twice, before steadying. I pulled the covers up to my chin, telling myself it was just a power surge. But then came the cold drafts, sweeping through the room as if someone had opened a window, even though they were all tightly shut. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, but every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, felt amplified, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. And then, just as I was on the verge of sleep, I felt it, a presence. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes, scanning the dark room, but nothing was there. Still, the feeling lingered, and with it came a whisper of a thought that I couldn't shake. It's because of the doll. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, the shadows in the corners of my room seeming to shift and grow, and the house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a stranger's home. A home that didn't want me there. The next morning, I awoke groggy and disoriented, the remnants of a restless night clinging to me like a heavy fog. The uneasy feeling from the previous night hadn't left. If anything, it had settled deeper into my bones. I tried to go about my day as usual, but every little sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had changed in my home. It started subtly at first. I would leave a room, and when I returned, objects were in different places. The remote that I was sure I had left on the coffee table would be on the couch. My keys, usually hung by the door, would be found on the kitchen counter. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. But as the day went on, the disturbances became harder to dismiss. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, just a shape that didn't belong. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The unease that had started as a mere whisper in the back of my mind had grown into a constant, throbbing anxiety. It felt like the walls of my house were closing in on me, the once familiar space now alien and hostile. The doll stayed in the box, but I could feel its presence, an almost tangible weight in the air. It was as if the object was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seeped into every corner of my home. The temperature in the house dropped, the air thick with an oppressive, stifling cold that I couldn't escape. I started to avoid certain rooms, unwilling to face the creeping dread that awaited me in every darkened corner. By the time night fell, I was on edge, my nerves frayed and raw. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate. As I lay in bed, the noises began again, faint at first, just the creaking of the floorboards, the subtle shift of shadows under the door. But then it escalated. Whispers, soft and indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot, filled the room. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakably malevolent. Desperation drove me to seek answers. The next day, I began researching the doll, trying to find out what it was and where it might have come from. I scoured the internet, looking up anything that matched the description. A cracked porcelain face, a strange locket, an aura of darkness. What I found only deepened my fear. The doll seemed to fit the profile of objects associated with dark folklore, items believed to carry curses or harbor malevolent spirits. I read stories of tragic events tied to such objects, of people driven mad, of lives destroyed. Some claimed these items were conduits for evil forces, entities that fed on fear and chaos. The more I read, the more I felt a growing sense of paranoia. My thoughts spiraled, each new piece of information a confirmation of the terror that had taken root in my home. That night, sleep eluded me. When I finally drifted off, I was plunged into a nightmare so vivid, so terrifying, that it felt more real than the waking world. I found myself in my own home, but it was different, twisted, distorted. The walls seemed to stretch and breathe. The floors groaned underfoot as if something was moving beneath them. I was being hunted, chased by an unseen force that I could feel but not see. No matter where I ran, I couldn't escape it. It was always just behind me, a presence I could feel breathing down my neck, whispering in my ear. I jolted awake, heart pounding, only to find the doll had moved. It was no longer in the box. It sat at the foot of my bed, the cracked eye staring straight at me. The locket on its chest swung gently, as if it had just been placed there. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gone near it since the day I found it. And yet, here it was, closer to me than ever before. Terror gripped me. I scrambled out of bed, backing away from the doll as if it were a living thing, capable of lunging at me at any moment. My breaths came in short, panicked gasps, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from that cracked, malevolent face. Something was very wrong. The object, the doll, it wasn't just a cursed trinket. It was something more, something that had awakened, and it was coming for me. I realized then that I couldn't stay here. But where could I go? The doll, this thing, had found me once. What was to stop it from finding me again? The night dragged on, every second feeling like an eternity as I sat there, paralyzed by fear, the weight of the object's presence crushing down on me. And through it all, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread, of being watched, of something ancient and evil lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to reach out for help, but every time I spoke to someone, every attempt to explain what was happening felt futile. My friends and family grew concerned as my behavior became increasingly erratic. I was short-tempered, irritable, and withdrawn. I'd cancel plans at the last minute, claiming I was sick or too tired. The truth was, I was terrified. I couldn't articulate the fear that gripped me, the sense that something was stalking me from within my own home. I pushed everyone away, convinced they wouldn't understand, or worse, that they would dismiss my fears as mere paranoia. The house became a prison. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that the walls were closing in on me. I felt like a caged animal, pacing the confines of my own home, unable to find solace anywhere. The doll was always there, a constant, menacing presence. Its aura seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its gaze following me wherever I went. I could almost sense it growing stronger, feeding off my fear. The apparition started small, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, fleeting glimpses of figures that disappeared when I turned to look. But soon, the phenomena grew more intense. I would hear disembodied voices whispering in the dead of night, their words indistinguishable but their tone unmistakably malevolent. The whispers seemed to come from the doll itself, as if it were a conduit for whatever dark force was at work. The voices would blend into one another, creating a cacophony of unsettling murmurs that never ceased. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway, bathed in shadows. It was vaguely human in shape but distorted, its features obscured. My heart raced as I stared at it, unable to move. The figure remained still, its presence oppressive, until it slowly faded away. The room felt colder, the air heavier. I could barely breathe. My nights were plagued by the most vivid and disturbing nightmares. In my dreams, I was trapped in the house, the rooms shifting and morphing around me, the walls closing in, suffocating me. I was constantly running from something I couldn't see but felt in my bones. Each time I awoke, drenched in sweat, the doll seemed to have moved even closer, as if it were inching toward me in my sleep. Desperation drove me to drastic measures. I decided to get rid of the doll. I tried throwing it away, placing it in the trash bin outside. But the next morning, it was back in the house, perfectly intact, sitting on the kitchen counter as if it had never left. I tried burning it in the backyard, but the flames would die out before the doll even scorched. Each time I tried to destroy it, it would reappear, unharmed and undamaged. The object seemed impervious to my efforts, as if it had a will of its own. My attempts to break free from its influence only seemed to strengthen its hold on me. The more I fought against it, the more relentless it became. The house grew darker, the shadows deeper, and the whispers more insistent. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I would hear things that weren't there, see things out of the corner of my eye, and experience moments of sheer terror that left me questioning my own sanity. One night, I sat in the dark, the doll in its box on the table, its presence a constant reminder of my torment. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. I could feel the walls of the house closing in on me, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. I was on the verge of a breakdown, consumed by fear and paranoia. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison from which I could see no escape. And through it all, the doll remained, a silent, malevolent force that seemed to revel in my suffering. The night after the apparition in the doorway, I knew I had to find out more about the doll. My sleepless nights and constant terror had reached a breaking point. I could no longer ignore the gnawing suspicion that there was something profoundly sinister about the object that had taken over my life. I spent hours poring over old records and obscure articles, driven by a growing sense of urgency. My research led me to an old, dusty library where I found references to a curse tied to similar objects. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the revelations became. I discovered that the doll was not just an innocent trinket but a vessel for a malevolent spirit, bound by a dark ritual conducted long ago. The object had been part of a series of crimes involving occult practices, leaving a trail of suffering and death in its wake. According to the documents, previous owners of the doll had met tragic ends. Some had vanished without a trace, while others had succumbed to madness or violent deaths. The more I read, the more I understood that the curse was not just a story but a reality, and I was now its latest victim. My blood ran cold as I realized the grim truth. I was next in line. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. Shadows seemed to writhe and twist, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the entity knew I was uncovering its secrets and was preparing for a final confrontation. That night, as I sat huddled in the living room, the lights flickered and went out. The darkness was thick and suffocating. I could hear a low, guttural growl emanating from the corners of the room. I tried to light a candle, but my hands trembled so violently that the match fell to the floor. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a cold wind swept through the house, carrying with it a palpable sense of malevolence. The doll appeared to move on its own, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The entity fully manifested before me, an amorphous, shadowy figure with eyes like burning coals. It was a grotesque mockery of humanity, its form shifting and undulating as it advanced towards me. The entity spoke, its voice a haunting chorus of whispers and growls. It revealed its intentions in a cold, detached manner. It sought to claim my soul or life as part of its dark ritual. The words it spoke were chilling, each one resonating with a promise of torment. The house seemed to warp and twist around me, becoming a nightmarish battleground as I tried to fend off the creature's advances. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for any way to escape this nightmare. I remembered a fragment of an old ritual I had read about, a potential way to break the curse. The ritual involved returning the doll to its place of origin, a remote and abandoned location tied to the original curse. It was a dangerous and risky endeavor, but it was my only hope. As the entity closed in, I scrambled to gather the strength to act. The house seemed to be alive with dark energy, the walls pulsating and shifting as if trying to prevent my escape. I knew the solution came with a terrible risk. Returning the doll might not only put me in danger, but could also anger the entity further. With a mixture of fear and determination, I prepared for the ritual. It was a race against time, with the malevolent force closing in on me. I had to overcome my terror and find the courage to confront the darkness before it was too late. I stood at the edge of the abyss, heart pounding and palms clammy. The air in the house was electric with tension, each breath a battle against the growing dread. My hands shook as I clutched the doll, the object of my torment, and prepared for the ritual. The dark entity was relentless, its presence suffocating, attempting to thwart me at every turn. Shadows writhed and coiled around me like living serpents, and the whispers grew louder, more frenzied. With trembling resolve, I began the ritual. I followed the ancient instructions to the letter, drawing symbols on the floor with salt and lighting candles, each flicker casting eerie shapes on the walls. The atmosphere was thick with an oppressive weight, the house seemingly closing in around me as if trying to smother the light I was trying to create. The entity manifested with an even more grotesque fury. The shadows converged, becoming a mass of swirling darkness that seemed to reach out for me. Its growls and shrieks were deafening, the very air vibrating with its rage. I felt as though the walls of the house were bending and warping, distorting reality itself to impede my progress. I was pushed to my physical and mental limits, each step of the ritual feeling like a struggle against an unseen force that wanted nothing more than to see me fail. My body ached from the strain, and my mind was on the brink of collapse. The house twisted around me, the floor shifting beneath my feet, the ceiling seeming to lower and press down on me. The very fabric of reality felt as though it was unraveling. Each time I tried to complete a step, the entity roared and lashed out, making the ground shake and the candles flicker wildly. In a final, desperate effort, I completed the last step of the ritual, reciting the final incantation with a voice that wavered but held firm. I could feel the energy in the room shift, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. The entity let out a final, piercing scream as if it were being torn apart. The shadows retreated, and the air became eerily still. With the ritual complete, I collapsed to the floor, utterly exhausted. The house fell silent. The once terrifying shadows had receded, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The doll was gone, vanished into the void, leaving only a cold, empty space where it had once been. I could hardly believe it was over. As I left the house behind, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The experience had left its mark on me, changing me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. The house, now devoid of its dark influence, felt oddly quiet and empty. I knew I had survived, but the memory of the entity and the dark forces that had plagued me lingered like a shadow over my mind. I moved away, hoping to find peace in a new place. But even as I settled into my new home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness wasn't fully gone. The silence of the new place was sometimes pierced by fleeting echoes of whispers, and I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadows of my past returning. The ordeal had ended, but its impact remained. I would never forget the terror, the struggle, or the darkness that had almost consumed me. And though I hoped to leave it all behind, a part of me knew that the darkness, once summoned, never truly vanishes. It lingers, waiting in the shadows, ready to return when least expected.